The HOA tried to ruin my ranch over a fence, so I bought the road they needed most and blocked it forever. Sounds insane, right? But it really happened to me. One small fence turned into a war of rules, a war of pride, a war of power. And when they thought they had won, I made one move they never saw coming, one move that left the entire neighborhood trapped, and the HOA begging for mercy. But to understand how it all began, you need to know who I am. Welcome back to HOA Unit. I'm Daniel, a simple guy living on the edge of a quiet suburban community. I run a small ranch, raise a few animals, and live a life most people would call peaceful. But peace doesn't last long when you live under an HOA. And my story proves just how far they'll go to control you, and how far I was willing to go to fight back. I told you who I am. Daniel, the man with the small ranch at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a place that should feel free, peaceful, simple. But peace never lasts long when the HOA is around. I remember the first day I moved in. The sun was heavy, the grass smelled sweet, and the land felt like mine. I stood there with a hammer in my hand, putting up the fence with my own sweat. It was nothing fancy, just wood and nails, painted bright so it wouldn't rot in the rain. To me, it was pride. To them, it was a problem. At first, the neighbors waved politely. They smiled from behind their trimmed hedges, with their perfect mailboxes lined in a row. But their smiles were stiff. Their eyes measured every detail of my land. I should have noticed then that in this suburb, fences were not just fences. They were symbols of who had power and who did not. The first letter came quiet, folded, neat and cruel. It said my fence was too gaudy, too bright, too loud for the neighborhood. They wrote that it had violated the character of the community. Funny thing is, no one ever asked me what my character was. I laughed at first. I thought it was a joke. I thought maybe a warning, or just one strict neighbor with too much time. But the second letter arrived, then the third, each one with bigger words, bolder threats. Then came the fines, $100, then $300, then more. I started to feel it, the weight of their eyes when I left for work, the whisper of their voices when I walked by. At night my ranch felt less like home and more like a stage, and the HOA, they were the cruel audience waiting for me to stumble. I sat in the meetings, tried to reason, tried to explain. I told them the fence was solid, safe, even better than the weak ones they had. But they smirked. The president called me the ranch man, like it was an insult. They voted against me, every time. And I could see it in their faces. It was never about paint. It was never about wood. It was about control of me, control of anyone who dared to be different. They wanted every house to look the same, every mailbox to stand the same, every blade of grass to grow at the same angle, and if you didn't fit their picture, they would paint you out. I came home one night and found another letter on my door, a final warning: repaint or remove or face legal action. And that's when I realized this was not just about a fence. This was war. But here's the thing about war. It doesn't always start with bullets or fire. Sometimes it starts with silence. Sometimes it starts with a smile that never reaches the eyes. Sometimes it starts with a simple wooden fence. The next morning, I walked along the edge of my land, tracing the fence with my hand. The wood was rough, strong, mine. I thought about tearing it down, about giving in, about buying peace with obedience. But then I looked at my animals grazing, my land stretching wide, my freedom breathing in the air, and I knew I could not bend, because if I bent once, they would break me forever. So I stood tall. I decided, if the HOA wanted a fight, I would not fight with paintbrushes. I would fight with something stronger. But I didn't yet know that I held the one thing they could never control. I had no idea that the road they used every day, the only road that carried their cars in and out, was about to become my weapon. My fence had started the battle, but the road would end it, still. That night I sat on my porch, staring at their letters, wondering, why do people cling to power so tightly over things so small? A fence, a mailbox, the color of grass. Why do they smile at you in daylight and scheme against you in the dark? And maybe the better question is this: if you were in my place, if the HOA tried to ruin you over something so petty, would you obey them? Or would you fight back with everything you had? Tell me, what would you do? The HOA president, her name was Linda. She lived 3 houses down. Perfect lawn, perfect roses, perfect lies. She would wave at me in the mornings. But her smile was sharp as glass. Behind her polite words, I could hear the venom. "This neighborhood has standards," she whispered once. And I realized I wasn't just fighting a fence violation. I was fighting her. Linda had power in her hands, and she used it like a hammer. Every meeting, she ruled the table. Every fine, she signed with pleasure. The others followed her, nodding like puppets. They feared her as much as I did, maybe more. One evening I walked into the clubhouse where the meetings were held. The smell of coffee and paper filled the air. Neighbors sat in a circle, stiff backs, cold stares. I stood before them, letters in my hand, heart pounding. I asked why my fence mattered more than my freedom. Silence, then smirks. Then Linda leaned forward. She said, "We are here to keep order, and people like you bring chaos." The room laughed softly. My face burned. I wanted to shout, to slam the table, to remind them this was my land. But something stopped me. Their arrogance, their certainty, their smug grins. I realized words would never win here. I would need something stronger, something they could not laugh away. So I sat quietly. I let them find me again. I let them feel victorious. But deep inside, something was growing. Not fear, not anger. A plan. I started studying the neighborhood at night, walking the edges, tracing the map with my eyes. I noticed the way cars flowed in and out. One road, only one. A narrow strip that cut through my property like a scar. Strange how no one mentioned it. Strange how no one cared. Until I thought about it deeper, one night I dug through old papers, dusty maps left in a folder from years ago. And there it was, in black and white, the road they all drove on, the lifeline of the community. It still belonged to me. No one had ever bought it. No one had ever noticed. The HOA had been trespassing on my land for years, and now that trespass would become my weapon. I sat back in my chair, staring at the map. I could hear the echo of Linda's voice calling me chaos. I could see the smug smile of the board as they fined me again and again, and I whispered to myself, "Chaos is coming." But I didn't move too fast. I had to be patient. I still went to the meetings, still nodded when they insulted me, still paid small fines just to keep them calm. All the while, I was gathering strength. The land office wasn't far. I signed the papers, filled the forms, every stamp like a drumbeat in my chest. It was slow, but steady. And when it was done, I walked out holding the deed. The road was mine, not just in spirit, not just in memory, but in law. And with that paper, the balance shifted. For the first time, I had something they wanted more than I feared them. I could feel it like fire in my veins. Power. I went home and stood at the edge of the road. Cars passed by. Neighbors waved without knowing. Children rode bikes, laughing in innocence. I smiled softly. Because they didn't know what was coming. They didn't know the ground beneath their tires was no longer theirs. The next day, another letter arrived. This time, a final notice. remove the fence, or face legal action, Linda's signature at the bottom. Bold and cruel, I laughed, loud enough for the horses to turn their heads, because I finally understood they had been so busy controlling me that they never realized I had been holding their leash the entire time. But I didn't act right away. I wanted them to feel safe, to think they had won. I wanted them to believe the fines and the threats had broken me, because when I struck, I wanted the shock to cut deep, and so I built quietly. Chains, steel posts, heavy gates, tools clanged in the night as I worked under the stars. Every strike of the hammer echoed with justice. Every spark of welding lit the darkness like revenge. When the gate stood ready, I stepped back and admired it. Tall, strong, unmovable. It was not just a gate. It was a line between me and them, a line they would never cross again. The morning came. Cars rolled down the road as usual, but this time they met steel and chains. Brakes screeched, horns blared, voices shouted. Linda's car stopped first. Her window rolled down, her face twisted in shock. She screamed my name, demanded I open it. I held up the deed in silence. And for the first time, her smile was gone. The neighborhood gathered, angry, confused, trapped. I stood on my side of Jansete, the gate. Calm, proud. The fence had been my crime, but the road was my victory. And in that silence, one thought burned in my mind. They wanted order. They wanted rules. Well, now they had to play by mine. But tell me this. If you had the power to shut the gate on people who tried to destroy you, would you open it for them or keep it locked forever? The sound of horns filled the air. Engines idled, voices shouted, doors slammed. The gate stood tall, chains glinting in the sun. And me, I just leaned against my fence, arms crossed, watching the show unfold. Linda was the first to break. She stormed out of her car, heels clicking like gunshots on the pavement. Her face was red. Her hands shook as she pointed at me. "You can't do this. You can't block our road," she screamed. I raised the deed higher. Let the paper flap in the wind. "Oh, I can," I whispered, and I just did. The crowd grew behind her, men in polo shirts with clenched jaws, mothers clutching kids with backpacks late for school, teenagers filming on their phones, hungry for drama, every eye on me, every curse aimed my way. But beneath the anger, I saw fear. Fear that the life they controlled so neatly was slipping out of their hands. Linda shouted for the police. Sirens wailed in the distance. Growing closer, I didn't move. The cops arrived, calm at first, then confused when they saw the deed in my hand. They checked, called it in, read the papers again and again. Finally, one officer looked at Linda and said, "He owns it. Nothing we can do." The silence that followed was sweeter than any music I had ever heard. Linda's face cracked, the mask slipping. For the first time, she had no power. Her words fell flat. Her threats turned to dust, and the neighbors watched her crumble. That was the moment I knew. The board was weak without her smalsha. Without her lies. They were nothing, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. They begged me to open the gate. Just for the kids. Just for the morning. I refused. They offered money. Weak bribes whispered like secrets. I refused. They threatened lawsuits. Endless meetings. More fines, I laughed. Because what could they fine me for now? When they couldn't even reach me, days turned into chaos. Traffic lined the outer roads. Neighbors cursed as they drove miles around to get to work. Deliveries piled at the edge of the gate. Trash trucks refused to enter, leaving bins overflowing in the sun. The perfect neighborhood was rotting from the inside, and I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching the empire burn. But here's the thing. Revenge is sweet, but it's never simple. I started noticing small things. Cars slowing near my land at night. Lights lingering too long. Anonymous letters shoved under my door. threats scribbled in shaky hands. "Open the gate or else," one read. Another simply said, "We will make you pay." I wasn't scared, not yet, but the tension grew heavy, like a storm cloud waiting to break. The board called emergency meetings, but without the road, without access. They were powerless, and I knew every minute of their suffering was a victory carved in steel. Still, I couldn't shake one thought. How far would they go, these people who worshipped order, who lived for control? What would they do when their control was gone completely? One night, I walked the road under the moonlight. The gate loomed like a sentinel, shadows stretching across the pavement. I placed my hand on the cold steel and wondered, did I go too far, or not far enough? Because deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. Linda wasn't finished. The board wasn't finished. And somewhere in their polished houses, they were plotting. I could feel their hatred like heat pressing through the walls. Neighbors who once smiled at me now glared from their windows. Kids who once waved now looked away. I was the outcast, the villain in their story. But I didn't care, because villains still win sometimes. The ranch was quiet those nights, too quiet. Even the animals sensed something in the air, a shift, a danger, a war waiting to spill from whispers into flames. And as I sat there under the stars, one question burned in my mind. If people who once pretended to be your neighbors suddenly became your enemies, would you forgive them for peace or keep fighting until they were broken completely? The night after the gate went up, I barely slept. The silence of the ranch felt heavy, too heavy. Even the crickets were quiet, like they were waiting for something to happen. I knew the HOA wouldn't give up. People like Linda never surrender. They plot, and sure enough, the war began in whispers. The next morning I found a note taped to my fence. The paper was thin, the words angry, "Open the gate, or we will make your life impossible." No name, no signature, just hate carved in ink. I laughed at first, but deep down I knew. This was their new game. Soon the little tricks started. Trash scattered across my driveway in the night, my mailbox stuffed with rotten food. Someone poured paint near my gate, thick red streaks like blood on steel. It was petty. It was cruel. It was their way of saying, "We can still reach you." But I didn't bend. I cleaned it up, fed my animals, drank my coffee with a smile, because every act of spite only proved one thing: they were losing control. And they knew it. Then came the noise, car horns blaring outside my land at midnight, engines revving. Lights flashing into my windows. I saw shadows moving by the gate. Neighbors standing there with signs that read, "Open the road," Linda at the front, her face lit by headlights. Chanting like a preacher of order, her voice carried through the night, sharp, "Open it, open it, open it." I stood on my porch and watched. I didn't shout back. I didn't argue. I just held up the deed high above my head. The crowd roared in anger, but their anger was powerless because the gate still stood. Days turned into a strange rhythm, work in the morning, chaos in the evening, letters in my mailbox, whispers at my fence, eyes following me in the store. It was like living inside a storm, but the storm only made me stronger, because every gust of hate reminded me I had already won the first battle. Then one evening, something new happened. I saw Linda standing at the gate alone. No crowd, no signs. Just her perfect hair out of place, her hands trembling. She looked at me with eyes that weren't angry anymore. They were desperate. She called out softly, "Daniel, we can make a deal." Her voice cracked. She offered me money, power, even a seat on the HOA board. She promised forgiveness, promised peace. All if I just opened the gate. I let her speak, every word dripping with the taste of defeat. Then I asked her one question. What happens when the board tries to control me again? She had no answer, and in that silence, I turned my back and walked away. The next morning the attacks grew sharper. A broken bottle on my porch, spray paint on my fence, the word traitor in dripping letters. I realized something then. This was no longer just about a fence, or a road, or even control. This was war of pride. Their pride against mine, their order against my freedom, and once pride is wounded, it never heals quietly. I knew they were watching me closer now. I saw cars parked at night near my property, windows rolled down, eyes hidden in the dark. I heard whispers at the store, laughter behind me, and I felt the tension in every step I took. But I didn't back down, because for the first time in years, I held the power and I wasn't going to give it back. One night, sitting by the fire, I asked myself, why do people cling so tightly to rules that make no sense? Why does a fence, a strip of paint, a simple gate, turn neighbors into enemies, turn friends into strangers? And maybe the better question is this: if you had a taste of power after years of being pushed down, would you hand it back for peace, or keep it burning even if it meant war forever? The quiet before the storm never lasts. And in my neighborhood, the storm was always waiting. I could feel it in the air, heavy, electric, sharp as a knife. After Linda's failed attempt to bargain, the board grew restless. Their petty tricks weren't working anymore. Their threats had lost their teeth, so they changed tactics. They decided to use the law. One morning, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox, my name stamped bold across the front. Inside was a letter, filled with long words, heavy ink, legal threats, lawsuits, demands for damages. They claimed I was blocking public access. They called me a danger to the community. They even said I was putting lives at risk. I laughed when I read it because the truth was simple. The road wasn't public, it was mine, and no amount of paper could erase the deed I held in my hand. But the lawsuits kept coming, one after another, each one thicker than the last. The HOA was bleeding money to fight me, hiring lawyers, holding meetings, whispering schemes in the clubhouse, and still, the gate stood strong. The irony was delicious. The more they fought, the weaker they became, the more money they wasted. The more divided they grew. Neighbors started whispering behind Linda's back. Some blamed her, others feared her, but slowly, cracks began to show in her perfect mask. One night I heard shouting near the gate. I stepped outside and saw two board members arguing, their voices sharp, hands waving, faces red with anger. They blamed each other for the mess. One said the fines had gone too far. The other said I should have been crushed early on. Linda stood there, silent, her face pale as the moon, and I realized the board was eating itself alive. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was suffering. Trash still piled high, deliveries lost, traffic jammed at the edges, families grew restless, tempers short. The suburb that once looked like a perfect postcard now looked like a battlefield. And in that chaos, I found my peace. Every morning I fed my animals, fixed my fence, sipped my coffee, while beyond the gate, my enemies choked on their own rules. The power had shifted completely. But then, something I never expected happened. One afternoon, a knock on my door. I opened it to see a woman. Not Linda, but my neighbor, Mrs. Harris, an elderly lady who had always smiled kindly at me before the war. She stood there, clutching her cane, her voice trembling. "Daniel, please. My medicine delivery can't get through. I need help." Her eyes weren't angry. They were tired. And for a moment, the war in my chest softened. I opened the gate just enough for her delivery truck, watched her eyes fill with relief. And I realized something important. This wasn't just revenge against the board anymore. It was hurting the innocent too, the children, the elderly, the families who had nothing to do with Linda's power games. They were caught in the fire, just like me, for the first time. I questioned myself. Had I become like the HOA, using rules to punish people who didn't deserve it? Was my justice turning into cruelty? The thought haunted me. I walked the road that night under the stars. Staring at the chains on the gate, I remembered the anger, the laughter at the meetings, Linda's smirk. But I also remembered Mrs. Harris's tired eyes, the way her voice cracked with desperation, and I asked myself, what kind of man do I want to be? The kind who rules with iron chains, or the kind who knows when enough is enough? The answer didn't come right away, because deep inside, another voice whispered, if you let go now, the HOA will rise again. If you open the road, they will crush you harder than before. I stood at the edge of the gate, torn between revenge and mercy, between justice and peace, and I realized, no matter what choice I made, the war would never truly end. But here's what I want to know from you. If you were in my place, would you keep the gate locked tight to teach them a lesson? Or would you open it and risk everything just to be the bigger person? The night after Mrs. Harris came to my door, I couldn't sleep. Her tired eyes haunted me. The weight of her voice pressed heavy in my chest. For the first time since this war began, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, doubt. The gate had given me power. But was it turning me into the same kind of monster I was fighting against? The HOA used rules to control, to punish, to break people. And now, wasn't I doing the same? But the very next morning, the doubt was drowned in fire, because Linda returned. Not with kindness, not with peace, but with fury. I heard shouting near the gate before sunrise when I walked out. I saw her car parked sideways across the road, her arms waving wildly, her voice sharp as knives. She had gathered people again. A mob this time, signs painted in red. Open the road. Down with the ranchman. Their voices echoed through the neighborhood like thunder. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. They wanted me broken. They wanted the gate gone. Linda's face twisted with rage as she screamed my name. Daniel, you will regret this. I felt the anger boiling in me again. The doubt vanished, replaced by the fire they had lit themselves. I walked up to the gate, held the deed in one hand, and with the other, I slammed the steel shut louder than ever. The chains rattled like thunder. The crowd roared back in anger, but I didn't flinch. The police came again. This time they tried harder, asked more questions, looked at me with uneasy eyes, but the law was still the same. The road was mine, and there was nothing they could do. The mob grew restless, louder, uglier. Eggs splattered against my fence, bottles smashed on the pavement. Someone even tried to climb the gate, until I stepped forward with a hammer in my hand. The sight of me, calm and unafraid, made them back off, but their eyes burned with hate, and in that moment, I understood. This war was no longer about fences or roads. It was about survival. The days that followed were worse. I found nails scattered across my driveway, slashing my tires, dead animals left near my fence line, cruel messages carved into wood. They wanted me afraid. They wanted me broken. But instead, it only made me colder. I doubled the locks on the gate, installed cameras, lights, alarms. At night, the glow of the floodlights cut through the darkness. My ranch became a fortress, and I became the man behind the walls. But power is a dangerous thing. The more they hated me, the more I enjoyed holding the keys, the more they cursed me, the more I smiled when their cars turned away. I had become their nightmare, and in some twisted way, I liked it. Still, there were cracks in my armor. Mrs. Harris stopped waving when she saw me. Parents pulled their children away from my fence. Some neighbors who had nothing to do with Linda now saw me as the villain, and maybe, in their eyes, I was. But then came the moment that sealed everything. One night, long after midnight, I heard a sound at the gate. I grabbed my flashlight and crept forward. The beam cut through the dark, and there she was, Linda, alone. Bolt cutters in her hands, her face pale, her breath heavy. She was trying to cut the chain. I shouted her name. She froze, the cutters slipping from her hands. For the first time I saw fear in her eyes. She wasn't the queen of the HOA anymore. She was just a desperate woman in the dark. I told her to leave. She begged instead. "Please, Daniel, this has gone too far." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Gone too far. But who was she talking about, me or herself? I watched her walk away into the night, her shoulders hunched, her power broken. And I realized something. This war wasn't ending with papers or chains. It was ending with people torn apart. I stood at the gate for hours after she left, the moon above me, the silence of the empty road, and I asked myself, what had I become? A man defending his freedom, or a tyrant hiding behind steel? Because sometimes revenge doesn't set you free. Sometimes it chains you tighter than your enemies ever could. And that's why I want to ask you this. If you were standing where I was, holding the keys to power, but losing the trust of everyone around you, would you let go of your revenge before it destroys you? Or would you keep holding on, no matter what it costs? The night I caught Linda at the gate, everything changed. She wasn't the queen anymore. She was just a shadow of herself, broken by the war she started, and when she walked away into the dark, I realized something I never expected. I didn't feel victory. I felt empty. The gate still stood strong, chains thick, steel unbreakable, but inside, I was starting to feel the cracks. I had won the battle, but what had I really gained? Neighbors no longer waved. Children no longer played near my land. Even the ones who never sat on the board looked at me with quiet hatred. In their eyes, I wasn't Daniel anymore. I wasn't the man with the ranch. I was the man with the gate, the man who cut them off, the villain of their story. The board meetings collapsed. The HOA that once barked order set me now whispered behind closed doors. Their power faded, their money drained. Linda resigned 1 week later. Too much shame, too much blame. Some cheered quietly when she left. Others cursed my name louder than ever. But either way, the neighborhood was no longer the same. I should have felt proud. I should have stood taller, laughed louder, enjoyed the taste of revenge. But instead, I sat on my porch with coffee in my hand, staring at the road that no one could use. It was mine. Yes. But what good is a road when no one walks it? Then came the day that forced me to decide. It was a Sunday morning, quiet, peaceful, until I saw flashing lights at the edge of my land. An ambulance stopped at the gate. The sirens wailed. The driver leaned out shouting at me, "Open it! We need to get through!" My chest tightened. Mrs. Harris, her house was on the other side. Her life depended on the road I had locked. In that moment, the war didn't matter. Linda didn't matter. The board didn't matter. Only one thing mattered. Would I keep the gate closed for pride, or open it for humanity? My hands shook as I unlocked the chains. The steel clanged to the ground. The gate swung open. The ambulance rushed through, dust flying behind its wheels, and I stood there, frozen, staring at the road for the first time. I felt what true power really meant. It wasn't holding people hostage. It wasn't punishing them for their rules. It was knowing when to let go. After that day, everything changed. The neighbors still whispered. Some still glared, but others softened. A child waved again. A man nodded as he drove by. Even Mrs. Harris smiled weakly when she saw me in the store. The HOA never regained its old power without Linda. without money, without order. It fell apart slowly. Meetings grew empty, rules grew weaker, and eventually, the board became nothing but a memory. And me, I still had my ranch, my fence, my freedom. But I also had something else, the knowledge that revenge may burn brie. But mercy. Mercy lasts longer. Now the gate stands open most days, not because they forced me, not because they won, but because I chose it, because I learned that true victory isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about knowing when the fight is over. Still, sometimes at night I walk to the edge of the road, I touch the cold steel, and I wonder, if I had kept it locked that day, if the ambulance had been too late, would I have been able to live with myself, or would the gate have become my prison forever? And so I ask you, if revenge gave you power, but mercy gave you peace, which would you choose?